The theory of the parent-infant relationship, D.W. WINNICOTT. The main point of this paper can perhaps best be brought out through comparison of the study of infancy with the study of psychoanalytic transference. It cannot be too strongly emphasized that my statement is about infancy, and not primarily about psychoanalysis. The reason why this must be understood reaches to the root of the matter. If this paper does not contribute constructively, then it can only add to the existing confusion about the relative importance of personal and environmental influences in the development of the individual. In psychoanalysis, as we know it, there is no trauma that is outside the individual omnipotence. Everything eventually comes under ego control and thus becomes related to secondary processes. The patient does not help if the analyst says, "Your mother was not good enough. Your father really seduced you. Your aunt dropped you." Changes come in analysis when the traumatic factors enter the psychoanalytic material in the patient's own way, and within the patient's omnipotence. The interpretations that are alternatively those that can be made in terms of projection. The same applies to the benign factors that led to satisfaction. Everything is interpreted in terms of the individual's love and ambivalence. The analyst is prepared to wait a long time to be in a position to do exactly this kind of work. In infancy, however, good and bad things happen to the infant that are quite outside the infant's range. In fact, infancy is the period in which the capacity for gathering external factors into the area of the infant's omnipotence is in the process of formation. The ego's support of maternal care enables the infant to live and develop in spite of his being not yet able to control or to feel responsible for what is good and bad in the environment. The events of these earliest stages cannot be thought of as lost through what we know as the mechanisms of repression, and therefore analysts cannot expect to find them appearing as a result of work which lessens the forces of repression. It is possible that Freud was trying to allow for these phenomena when he used the term primary repression, but this is open to argument. What is fairly certain is that the matters under discussion here have had to be taken for granted in much of the psychoanalytic literature. Returning to psychoanalysis, I have said that the analyst is prepared to wait till the patient becomes able to present the environmental factors in terms that allow of their interpretation as projections. In the well-chosen case, this result comes from the patient's capacity for confidence, which is rediscovered in the reliability of the analyst in the professional setting. sometimes the analyst needs to wait a very long time, and in the case that is badly chosen for classical psychoanalysis, it is likely that the reliability of the analyst is the most important factor, or more important than the interpretations, because the patient did not experience such reliability in the maternal care of infancy. And if the patient is to make use of such reliability, he need to find it for the first time in the analyst's behavior. This would seem to be the basis for research into the problem of what a psychoanalyst can do in the treatment of schizophrenia and other psychoses. In borderline cases, the analyst does not always wait in vain. In the course of time, the patient becomes able to make use of the psychoanalytic interpretations of the original traumata, his projections. It may even happen that he is able to accept what is good in the environment as a projection of the simple and stable going on being elements that derive from his own inherited potential. The paradox is that what is good or bad in the infant's environment is not in fact a projection, but in spite of this, it is necessary if the individual infant is to develop healthily, that everything shall seem to him to be a projection. Here we find omnipotence and pleasure principle in operation, as they certainly are in earliest infancy, and to this observation we can add that the recognition of a true not-me is a matter of the intellect. It belongs to extreme sophistication, to the maturity of the individual. In the writings of Freud, most of the formulations concerning infancy derive from study of adults and analysis. There are some childhood observations caught in real material, and there is the analysis of little Hans. At first sight, it would seem a great deal of psychoanalytic theories about early childhood and infancy. But in one sense, Freud can be said to have neglected infancy as a state. This is brought out by a footnote in formulations on the two principles of mental functioning, in which he shows that he knows he is taking for granted the very things that are under discussion in this paper. In the text, he traces the development from the pleasure principle to the reality principle, following his usual course of reconstructing the infancy of his adult patients. The note runs as follows. It will rightly be objected that an organization which was a slave to the pleasure principle and neglected the reality principle of the external world could not maintain itself alive for the shortest time, so that it could not have come into existence at all. The employment of a fiction like this is, however, justified when one considers that the infant, provided one includes with it the care it receives from its mother, does almost realize a psychical system of this kind. Here, Freud paid full tribute to the function of maternal care, and it must be assumed that he left this subject alone because he was not ready to discuss its implications. The note continues. It probably hallucinates the fulfillment of its internal needs. It betrays its unpleasure. When there is an increase of stimulus and an absence of satisfaction, by the mother discharge of screaming and beating about with its arms and legs, if then experiences the satisfaction it has hallucinated. Later, as an older child, It learns to employ these manifestations of discharge intentionally as methods of expressing its feelings. Since the later care of children is modeled on the care of infants, the dominance of the pleasure principle can really come to an end when a child has achieved complete psychical detachment from its parents. The words, provided one includes with it the care it receives from its mothers, have great importance in the context of this study. The infant and the maternal care together form a unit. Certainly, if one is to study the theory of the parent-infant relationship, one must come to a decision about these matters, which concern the real meaning of the word world, dependence. It is not enough that it is acknowledged that the environment is important. If there is to be a discussion of the theory of the parent-infant relationship, then we are divided into two. If there are some who do not allow that at the earliest stages the infant and the maternal care belong to each other, health belong to each other and cannot be disentangled. These two things, the infant and the maternal care, disentangled and dissociate themselves in health. And health, which means so many things, to some extent means a disentanglement of maternal care from something which then call the infant or the beginnings of a growing child. This idea is covered by Freud's words at the end of the footnote. The dominance of the pleasure principle can really come to an end only when a child has achieved complete psychical detachment from his parents. The middle part of this footnote will be discussed in a later section, where it will be suggested that Freud's words here are inadequate and misleading in certain respects, if taken to refer to the earliest stage. The word infant in this paper, the word infant will be taken to refer to the very young child. It is necessary to say this because in Freud's writings, the word sometimes seems to include the child up to the age of the passing of the Oedipal complex. Actually, the word infant implies not talking. Infans, and it is not unuseful, and it is not unuseful to think of infancy as the phase prior to the word presentation and the use of word symbols. The corollary is that it refers to a phase in which the infant depends on a maternal care that is based on maternal empathy rather than on understanding of what this is, or could be verbally expressed to be. This is essentially a period of ego development, and integration is the main feature of such development. The id forces, clamors for attention. At first they are external to the infant. In health, the id becomes gathered into the service of the ego. The ego masters the id, so that the id's satisfactions become ego strengtheners. This, however, is an achievement of healthy development. And in infancy, there are many variants dependent on relative failure of this achievement. The ill health of infancy, achievements of this kind are minimally reached, or maybe one lost. In infantile psychosis or schizophrenia, the id remains relatively or totally external to the ego. And id satisfactions remain physical and have the effect of threatening ego structure until, that is, defenses of psychotic quality are organized. I am here supporting the view that the main reason why an infant in development, the infant that usually becomes able to master and the ego to include the id is the fact of the maternal care, the maternal ego implementing the infant ego and so making it powerful and stable. How this takes place will need to be examined, and also how the infant ego eventually becomes free of the mother's ego support, so that the infant achieves mental detachment from the mother. That is differentiation into a separate personal self. In order to examine the parent-infant relationship, it is necessary first to attempt a brief statement of the theory of infant emotional development. In psychoanalytic theory, as it grew up, the early hypothesis concerned the id and the ego mechanisms of defense. It was understood that the id arrived on the scene very early indeed, and Freud's discovery and description of pregenital sexuality, based on his observations of the regressive elements found in genital fantasy and play, and in dreams, our main features of clinical psychology. Ego mechanisms of defense were gradually formulated. These mechanisms were assumed to be organized in relation to anxiety, which derived either from instinct tension or from object loss. This part of psychoanalytic theory presupposes a separateness of the self and a structuring of the ego, perhaps a personal body scheme. At the level of the main part of this paper, the state of affairs cannot yet be assumed. The discussion centers around the establishment of precisely this state of affairs, namely the structuring of the ego, which makes anxiety from instinct, tension, or object loss possible. Anxiety at this early stage is not castration anxiety or separation anxiety. It relates to quite other things, and is, in fact, anxiety about annihilation, the Athanasius of Jones. In psychoanalytic theory, ego mechanisms of defense largely belong to the idea of a child that has an independence, a truly personal defense organization. On this borderline, researches of Klein add to Freudian theory by clarifying the interplay of primitive anxieties and defense mechanisms. This work of Klein concerns earliest infancy and draws attention to the importance of aggressive and destructive impulses that are more deeply rooted than those that are reactive to frustration and related to hate and anger. Also in Klein's work, there is a dissection of early defenses against primitive anxieties, anxieties that belong to the first stages of the mental organization, splitting, projection, and introjection. The night of introjection projected afterwards again, castration prior to it. Reflected later. Reticulate. What is described in Melanie Klein's work clearly belongs to the life of the infant in its earliest phases, so we can discard them and move on. And to the period of dependent with which this paper is concerned. Melanie Klein made it clear that she recognized that the environment was important at this period. Yes, I feel so much in various ways at all stages. I suggest, however, that her work and that of her co-workers leaves open for further considerations, the development, and his working with it in the transference. It would seem that the study of ego defenses takes the investigator back to pregenital id manifestations, whereas the study of ego psychology takes him back to dependence, to the maternal care, infant unit. One half of the theory of the parent-infant relationship concerns the infant, and is the theory of the infant's journey from absolute dependence through relative dependence to independence, and in parallel, the infant's journey from the pleasure principle to the reality principle, and from autoerotism to object relationships. The other half of the theory of the parent-infant relationship concerns maternal care. That is to say, the qualities and changes in the mother that meet the specific and developing needs of the infant towards whom she orientates.